Hello and welcome to another Jobava London game. And today we have Alireza Firouzja with the white pieces versus Jan Nepomniatchi, who was a former World Chess Championship challenger. And in this game, let's see, it took place in 2024. So we'll do a quick game review, just the score here to see what these players did during the game. So it looks like white, which was Firouzja, had 94.7 versus 87.1 by Nepomniatchi. And let's see, 2,800 playing strength in that game for Firouzja versus 2,650 by Nepomniatchi. So let's take a look at this game. It looks like it was a longer time control game. So the players will have more time to pick the best moves. And let's see what they did here. So Firouzja starts out with knight to c3. So that's a little bit different. If you're trying to do the Jobava London, you probably won't start that way. You'll probably start with d4. So the game continues with knight to f6 and now d4 and after d5. So now we're steering back towards the Jobava London, which is this setup here with the knight at c3. So that's different from the normal London, of course. And here, once again, I had a viewer ask about what's the difference between putting the knight here or on d2. Well, on c3, this knight's a little more active. So if we look at this position, if instead the pawn were pushed, or this knight was moved to d2 and this pawn was pushed to c3, this knight might be a little more active. Well, normally you have knight to f3, so those two knights would be even. But a lot of times this knight would jump to c6 and it would be a little more active than white's knight if it was on d2. So from here, you could have the chance to jump up to b5 and try and fork the king and the rook, or at least threaten to do that. There are ways that can be stopped. And a lot of times early in the game, a6 or c6, something will be played to prevent that knight from jumping forward anyway. So let's see what happened here. c5 is played, a common move, attacking this valuable pawn in the center. So e3 is played to keep an eye on this pawn, to let the bishop out. Or more importantly, by playing this e3 move, the bishop is keeping an eye on this b5 square in case that knight wants to jump to b5. So the game continues with capture, capture, and now a6. So Nepomniatchi plays a6, preventing future threats of that knight jumping to b5 and threatening a fork, causing any problems. So now what do you do with this knight? So let's find out what Alireza Firouzja does with the knight, because that was another question. If the knight can't move forward, what should it do then? Well, sometimes the knight will just stay here and guard, e4, keep an eye on d5, and other times the knight will move, sometimes to a4, maybe keeping an eye on c5, or thinking about jumping to b6. But a lot of times the knight could retreat to e2. That way the c pawn could then fortify this d4 pawn. But let's see what happens here. Knight to f3, and now we have a pin on that knight. So immediately the bishop is attacked, asking what is this bishop going to do now, retreat or exchange. So we have an exchange and the bishop pair is given up for this knight. So queen recaptures. So maybe this wasn't the best plan to capture. What did the computer say about that? So the computer says that is best to capture there. It does prevent this knight that was on f3 from maybe jumping up to e5 in the future. But this gets rid of the bishop pair, so black will no longer have the bishop pair, and white's queen recaptures here. So it kind of just helped develop that queen. And now knight to c6. So, if that knight had landed on d2, well, then this knight on c6 would be a little bit stronger than the knight if it was here on d2. So another reason you might want to consider jumping the knight to c3 and playing this Jabava-London system. All right. Game continues with castling queenside, which can be played sometimes by white in the Jabava-London. And then, there could be possible play up this half-open e-file. But in the Jabava-London, it's a flexible opening. Sometimes the king will castle queenside, sometimes kingside, and once in a while the king will even just stay in the center. But it really depends on what your opponent is playing. So, a flexible opening for white, and that might be why this opening seems to be popular lately, because it gives white different options depending on what your playing style is and what your preferences are. All right, so we have e6, which just fortifies the central pawn and lets this bishop develop. So another common theme. Now that white has castled queenside, he doesn't have to worry about any weaknesses on the king side and can just march these pawns forward and get an attack going on the king side, because that's a more likely direction for black to castle to. He probably won't castle over here, and it looks like we may end up with a opposite side castling game in which both sides want to throw their pawns forward and funnel the pieces in behind for an attack on the king. So bishop to d6, another common move. So sometimes these pieces are exchanged off, but Firouzja declines to exchange them and instead retreats back, keeping the bishop pair. But this bishop is a little bit passive here, trapped behind its own pawn on d4. So the game continues with queen to a5, developing the queen, eyeing the king side here. So what do we have next? How does Firouzja respond to this? Well, king to b1 to help keep an eye on this pawn. And also, king to b1, that does get the king off of this half-open c-file in case a rook develops there in the future, lining up on the king. But also the knight is free, like I said, to maybe move to e2, and this pawn will be protected now by the king. All right, so moving on, we have knight to b4. So the knight jumps forward. Computer says that's an inaccuracy, that just rook to c8 would have been better. This does add pressure to this pawn, but the knight and the king are doing a good job protecting that pawn. So what did this move really accomplish here? Let's look at what the computer recommended. Just rook to c8, placing the rook on the half-open file where it has more scope. And what should be the continuation? Apparently, the best continuation is just to attack the knight by pushing this pawn to g5. So after that, what's recommended here? Just a retreat by the knight to d7. So let's see what happened in the game after this knight to b4 move. Well, after that, we have a bishop retreat here, which helps guard here on the king side. Maybe once this pawn pushes and drives the knight back, there could be a possible threat of picking off this pawn and opening the king side up a little bit. But let's see what happened here. So the rook takes the half open file. We have an attack on the knight, driving that knight back, and then the retreat of the knight. So the game continues with g5, chasing the knight, and the knight just retreats back, and then we have h4. So, like I said, the pawn storm continuing here, and black is hesitant, it appears, to castle with these pawns moving up the board. So let's see how the continuation occurs here. So queen to b6, just lining up on the king with the threat of picking off this a3 pawn because this pawn on b2 is pinned by the queen. But the computer says this is a mistake, that an immediate b5 would have been better. So this is what the computer wants, threatening to push forward and try and break open the king side a little bit. And then here, what's recommended? Knight to a2 to help cover this. That way if the pawn pushes forward, the queen is now able to come over here and help a little bit along with this bishop. The knight is kind of covering this square. So, the recommended continuation is b4, knight captures, and bishop captures. And then after we capture, there is a possible threat of capturing with the knight, threatening a mate. But it looks like the queen could probably just block that. So computer recommends capturing with the queen here. And then, let's see, queen to e3. So something like this. This is one way the game could have played out. But in the actual game, after h4 by Firouzja, we have queen to b6, the move that was a mistake, and the game jumps to +1.5 in white's favor. But a missed opportunity with bishop to h3. The computer says that h5 would have been best, just continuing on with this pawn storm marching up the board. And then what? Looks like knight to e7. And then computer recommends rook to h3 as being best. So, giving the rook a little bit more scope where it could move along the third rank if needed. But now the computer's saying that that's an inaccuracy, that even better would have just been bishop to g2, connecting the rooks. And then here, rook to c4, just adding pressure. So the game could have continued in that manner, but instead, bishop to h3 was played, which also connects the rooks. And then, what do we have next? Knight captures. Queen moves over here to e3, which prevents this knight from moving, or the queen will be picked off. So what do we have next? Bishop to e5, a blunder by Nepomniatchi. So what would have been better? According to the computer, excuse me, my mistake there. The knight is guarding that queen. So, better would have been to just retreat the knight now. So knight to b5. And then what? Knight takes d5 because the pawn is pinned by the queen. So, perhaps Nepomniatchi saw that and didn't want to go into this line with, excuse me. Well, that move is possible as well. And now it says that is a great move. So let's look at the other move, this move. And the computer is now saying that is best. So computer is just having difficulty here making up its mind. But the queen would be under attack. So what could we do here? Computer says this is best. Um, oh, or did I get that wrong? Let me go back here. Excuse me, I did get that wrong. Queen to c6. So this move, threatening to just pick this pawn off with a check. And then what should be played here? Looks like queen to e4, just protecting the pawn. But now, bishop takes a3. Now the computer is saying that that is a mistake. That knight to c5 would have been better. Just moving here and attacking the queen. But I'm not going to dig all the way into that. Let's finish this game out and see what happened. Queen to e3. And now this blunder move. Now let's see why this is a blunder. Looks like f4, just attacking the bishop would be the best continuation. But let's see what happens after that. So now rook captures, queen captures, knight to b5, attacking the queen. And then the game continues with queen to f3, bishop centralizes, and king over to a2, helping keep an eye on this pawn, getting out of the line of fire of the queen. Computer says that's an inaccuracy. It would have been better to go to a1, but then you'd kind of be lined up on the bishop. Or the bishop would be lined up on the king. So we have g6 here. Another inaccuracy by Nepomniatchi, and apparently knight to c5 would have been better, just bringing this king up and aiding in the attack. But it looks like white still has a plus 1.5 advantage. So here, just f5 is recommended, just pushing forward, trying to maybe open things up here. And to prevent that, e6 is recommended by the computer. And then that does allow queen captures this pawn. Although now the computer doesn't like that, and it says f6 would be even better. So we could look at that. f6, e4, attacking, queen up to g4, threatening maybe a check here. Oh, and that would be a mate, I do believe. So now the recommendation is to just go ahead and castle. All right, so back to the game. We had king to a2, g6 was played, but now h5. Trying to get some play here on the king side. And the game continues with knight to c5. Bishop retreats back and lines up on this knight, maybe trying to knock out some of these attackers that are building up here on the queen side. So knight to e4, centralizing the knight on an outpost there. Capture with the pawn, and we have captures over on this side as well. So now rook at h to e1, lining up on the king, and a mistake is made here. Rook to f8, the game losing mistake. So better would have been to castle. So if we had castling, what do they recommend now? Queen to b1, or excuse me, king to b1. Although now it's saying it would have been better to just capture the knight. So then we would have capture, queen captures, and this bishop is under attack. So bishop to g7, and bishop to e3, attacking the queen. Although now the computer is recommending this move, rook up to the 7th rank. So here, if the queen is under attack, queen to c6. just threaten to attack the queen. So we could look at this rook move. So if that is played, then what? Rook to f7 and bishop up to e3 attacking the queen. Yeah, and here, I don't know, the computer is giving me conflicting recommendations. So what next? Queen to a6 lining up on the king. So that's a possibility. And it looks like that would be best. And now rook to d3, helping cover this pawn. And rook to c7. So the game could have commenced or continued in that fashion. But now we have rook to h1. Rook at h to e1 is what happened in the game, lining up on the king. So this is how the game continued. After this move, which lines up on the queen, this was the game-losing mistake because Firouzja continues with this queen move, and here Nepomniatchi resigns. So can you see why he resigns here? Well, let's see what the computer recommends. Computer recommends b4, but then you just pick off this bishop because the rook and the queen are both piling up on this bishop. So, if the bishop tries to move to safety with, I don't know, something like this, well, now the knight is picked off. So capture, and the pawn cannot capture this rook, or else there's a mate. The queen will move up here to d7 and deliver a checkmate. So, what is the recommendation? Rook to f5, and then white would just be ahead material. So this is what I'm talking about. If this is captured, well, then you just have a mate here. So, that is why Nepomniatchi resigned here. Firouzja ends up winning after what position? After this move. Because the bishop is going to be captured. What could be played here? You could just give up some material. Capture and try and take a pawn with this bishop. But, then this knight is still under attack here and can be captured. All right. Well, what is another option? If the knight tries to jump here and attack the rook, well, then the queen can still just pick off this bishop here. And then the knight cannot capture the rook as the queen would be under attack. So the queen would probably capture, then the rook would jump up here and not be under attack anymore. So you get the picture. Another interesting example of play in the Jabava London. If we go back to the beginning and just see how it started out a little bit differently and just transposed into the Jabava London. And once again, what do you do with this knight? Let's take a quick look at that. If the knight cannot move forward, well, what did it end up doing here? The knight just sits there guarding the center and guarding this e4 square. And so, that's another answer to the question, well, what can you do with this knight? A lot of times the knight will just stay here guarding the queen side if the king castles there, or just, and at the same time, just keeping an eye on e4 and d5. So, yeah, that knight just sat there the whole time pretty much for most of the game. Finally, that knight is just picked off. So there you go. Another example where top level players are playing the Jabava London system. So I'll have some future videos with more games in the Jabava London by the top players in the world. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to leave any comments that you would like if you have something to say about the Jabava London or anything else. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.